stories turn songs into symphonies, events into memories, and lives into legends. In our crowded world, knowing your story cuts through the noise so you can make your mark, whether you want to sell more books, increase profits, or just make a difference. At Sterling & Stone, story is our business. The Story Studio podcast is where we explore ways we can all tell our stories better. And now, with the Story Studio podcast number 1, here's Johnny, Sean, and Dave.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Story Studio, presented by Sterling & Stone. The Story Studio by Sterling & Stone, the Story Studio with Sterling & Stone, I'm not exactly sure. And that's really odd because for those of you, we have two audiences tuning into this episode. Some are people who have found this, somebody referred them or something, and you were looking on iTunes for Story and you came across this show and you decided to give it a shot. But then we have actually a whole existing audience. We'll tell that story in a bit. And so it's kind of interesting for the three of us who have a history of podcasting on basically this topic, but not quite this topic, for like 5 years to make this shift. And it's really exciting for episode 1 of the Story Studio.
Yeah, I'm surprisingly excited. I feel a little bit giddy. I know Dave's never felt giddy in his life, so I don't know. We said, Dave, can you this is our first episode. Can you be a little happy? He goes, I'm happy enough.
I believe the answer was no. Like, I think it was.
He said no, not right now. Actually,
not right now.
And Johnny said, well, we have 2 minutes until we go live.
So things were brought up and he woke up a little bit. But I do think a round of introductions is in order. We do tend to assume that people know what's inside our heads. And in this case, I think a lot of people, we could tend to think that we know who people think that people know who we are, which they don't necessarily. The people who followed us over from the self-publishing podcast will, but you newcomers, let's do a quick round. My name's Johnny B. Truant.
That's not his real name, though.
But that's as far as you're going to get.
But you're already introducing yourself as a liar, just so you know.
The guy who keeps interrupting me, that's Sean Platt.
Sean.
And the grumbly guy is David.
I'm David.
David W. Wright.
Oh, he's going to be David in this new show. Fuck Dave. He's David.
He's been Dave for the entire time, but now he's going to be David. So anyway, and our company is Sterling & Stone, and we are a story studio. And anybody want to describe what that is? What exactly do we do?
I really enjoy hearing Dave fumble around this answer. So should we do that before?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's start this podcast off on the wrong foot.
Yeah, great idea, Sean.
Well, there's good comedy there. Yeah, so we do a lot of stuff. Primarily we are in the storytelling business. We've written and published over 100 books in-house, primarily with the three of us over the last 6 years now. If you go back to the self-publishing podcast, episode 1, we talk about Sterling & Stone. It has grown up a lot in that time. It's become something very different. We not only write a lot of books, we're in the education and experience for authors business too, but we don't have any courses or anything. We have something called Stories to Go, which is kind of like a package that teaches writers what to do. We built the Story Shop software, and we're eventually getting into graphic novels and television and film and all of that. We are firmly in story, but also Johnny and I especially have strong marketing backgrounds and kind of understand story on a business branding, psychological level. And we're really excited just about that in general. And we find ways to kind of bake marketing into our art so that we don't ever have to think about it as this ugly thing that we hate doing. It just becomes part of the overall experience. And so
it becomes something ugly that Dave hates doing.
Right. That will never change. I mean, Dave thinks all marketers are evil. All marketing is evil. And
not all, just 99.9%.
We've been working together for 5 or 6 years now, and I think Dave is finally beginning to come around that I can actually play the second leg of my long con.
Maybe I'm just starting to trust you, although I'm not entirely convinced that the family that I met of yours is a real family and not paid actors. I do carry a decoy family like any good person.
It's like the movie Boyhood, right? You have to hire the same family every year when Dave comes to town, right? They age along with you.
Right. I'm going to swap one out at some point when there's a labor dispute.
See if he notices.
So anyway, like you said, our company is Sterling and Stone. Our 6-word intro is we make stories and smarter artists, making artists smarter. Get it? And the podcast that preceded this, just a little bit of history for those of you who don't know us. A large portion of people who are listening to this already know all this. So hang in there. This is like a recap. You get to feel like OGs at this point. But for people who have no idea about our experience in podcasting, so I can stop saying 5 or 6. Do you know what it was? Was it 5 years ago for the first episode of the self-publishing podcast?
Well, it was in 2012. So it's not quite 6 years. I think it was around March of 2012.
5 years and change. I knew Sean from actually online like content marketing, blog writing circles. And I knew that he was working with Dave on writing fiction in a way that wasn't the traditional write a book and submit to an agent and pray sort of approach. That
Kindle was still new. Kindle was it was this new exciting thing, but it wasn't a thing. Indie publishing was not an industry like it is now.
So I kind of, badgered Sean into beginning this podcast. And then Dave, of course, had to come along for the ride. And I appreciated the humor of that once I got to know Dave. I'm sure he wasn't going willingly. I'm sure there was much.
Oh, there was kicking and screaming for sure.
There was arm twisting. I launched an investigation.
He did launch an investigation. Johnny, I don't even know how you passed it, actually. Johnny 1.0 really should not have passed Dave Sniff.
No, really shouldn't. I mean, he probably thought I was like a guy from New York. You know how considered those guys are. That's a joke. So anyway, we started the self-publishing podcast. I had one book that I'd written by myself, and I'd written it like a decade earlier, but I finally like polished it up and published it. And the idea was that I was going to learn this whole self-publishing as a business thing. This idea of, you could determine your own success because you determined your own speed and controlled your own calls to action in the front and back of the books. And so we started the self-publishing podcast, and I was going to be the guy who didn't know anything. And if you go back and listen to episode 1, way back in the self-publishing podcast classics feed is probably where it is. I don't remember. You can hear that. And so we've spent the last 5.5 years since that podcast started working together, growing a larger and larger business. And now we've branched out into so many more things that we decided it was kind of time to not retire the self-publishing podcast, which had become an authority in its own right, in its own like little cult, not literally. Hopefully, Dave probably has the plans for that.
I do have Kool-Aid prepared. But I was going to do it on the 300th episode, but we stopped the show.
We stopped at $2.99, which seems.
Who thinks that Dave's Kool-Aid is Diet Coke flavored?
I see many hands raising. So anyway, we decided not really to retire the self-publishing podcast, but to evolve it. And we realized that we used to speak entirely to writers, and that meant that just about anybody who wanted to get into this self-publishing, like storytelling literally on a page for a book sort of business, and that we're really talking more to storytellers, which is a different thing. And that's why we decided to do this podcast.
Yeah, story is in everything. And I think that the more you understand what story is and you can see the patterns, it doesn't matter what you do in life. Certainly if you're an artist, you're going to create better art if you have a narrative. And if you're in business, you can create better business with narrative and with arc. And just understanding story and looking at those elements, it is a life changer. I know that once I started getting involved in story, not just as a writer, but as a creator in business, and seeing how story could influence business, everything changed. And I really am just in love with this company. I'm in love with the community, both in and around the company. And I'm really excited by this kind of reboot of the podcast because, if you look at story, there's the best versions of the stories. And then there's stories that you're so comfortable with and you really enjoy watching them or experiencing them because you always have. And I think every single person, 100% of the people listening to this right now, can think of a show that they really loved. And at the very end, the final season, the final 2 seasons, they were watching it because of the way it made them feel so many times before. This happens with food, like a lot of times when we're tasting food and we're eating food, we're actually eating a memory of a time that was really delicious. And it's
Baby's memories. Same joke, same time.
Damn. So I think that we felt like that was happening. Like, we got to leave the story at the right time. As a storyteller, you want to leave your audience wanting more, not tired of the same old thing. And we got to a point with our last show where we knew we were approaching Dexter season 5 territory. Dexter season 4 ended on like just an amazing note. And if that show had just walked off, dropped the mic right there, it would have been legendary. Instead, it diluted itself year after year after year. And we were starting to dilute ourselves. And
Dave was starting to murder people. It was
crazy. His basement just is piled with bodies at this point.
Right.
And
I was trying to, improve the ending of Dexter.
Right.
Well, after a while, we got to see that. I mean, it happened really quick. We flirted with it as an idea. You know what? We should just start a new podcast. And then by the end of that same week, we were all in agreement. And it was actually really surprising to see Dave like, yeah, I'm ready for this. And I think we all realized, wow, there is a sense of true enthusiasm that has been missing for a little while. And if we're missing it, then our audience has to be missing it too. So where do we reach?
In truth, I just wanted a week off.
But you didn't get a week off.
You didn't get a week off.
I know. I'm very disappointed.
Now you're going to be bitter for another 5/6 years. This isn't good.
Oh, I didn't like that. So I'm gonna go to Dave on this one. There were a lot of things that we liked about the old show, and that things that we wanted to see moving into this show. So Dave, where do you come down on that? What was great about the self-publishing podcast, and what do we want to evolve here from your perspective?
What I liked most was obviously the things that came out of the show, the organic conversations, the just pretty much everything around it that happened, the community that grew up around it. I love that a lot. The show itself, though, specifically, I liked when we had a guest that whenever you book a guest, like, there's different sorts of guests. There's ones that we know and we have an existing relationship with, and then there's others that we don't know that approach us. And generally speaking, we didn't take a lot of people that approached us. We like to have some sort of vibe, but every now and then there was somebody that approached us that we didn't know. And as we spoke to them, like, you could feel some magic happening, like a really good date, I suppose. Just like you hit on all the right notes, and you learn something that you didn't know before, and you feel your mind expanding a bit. And those are the sorts of things that I enjoy most about any podcast, but definitely self-publishing podcasts.
Do you remember Ray Chase, the episode with Ray Chase, when he just started going into the Morgan Freeman talking about the Queen?
That was on the other show, which we shall not mention.
No, it wasn't. Not the first time, because it was the 99 Designs ad read. It was right, like he just jumped into the ad read.
Yes, and we had fun on the old self-publishing thing.
And we had just met him, and we're like, oh, he's one of us. And that was like a magical moment.
The community is amazing. We hold a summit, a conference, basically, but conference is dry and boring. It's a summit every year in Austin, Texas. And, we get to see our community, and it really is a special community. I don't want to belabor this. I don't want to beat it to death. But the people that and not just the summit, but our Facebook group, the Smarter Artist Facebook group, and the people who interact in the orbit of this community it's a step above. It's not a bitchy author community where there's a lot of competitiveness and kind of attempts to kind of one up one another or be bitchy or moany or whatever. And so that's what we want to continue going forward. The reason that we wanted to move beyond the self-publishing podcast wasn't because we were discontented with it in any particular way. It was because it didn't fit what it is we were doing. We've grown out and we do a lot more things now. And so what Dave was mentioning, like the people we know and the people who are interesting to us, we couldn't bring on because the name of our show is the Self-Publishing Podcast, and they might not have anything to do with self-publishing.
Yeah, I think that's it right there. For me, my favorite thing in the early days, always, it was the sense of discovery. It was that we were doing new things and it was exciting to talk about. And just to kind of rewind like all of this, when Johnny said he badgered us into the show, the way he got me at least to do this was because it was a different audience with some different expectation. And we never tried to blow up a podcast at all. I had just come off of like blowing up a list where I had a list of 15,000 writers, and I said, I don't want to ever do this again. I don't want to.
Dave had just come off blowing up a Target.
No, I think they have this. It was the same week, but I just didn't want. I didn't want to build a list. I didn't want to blog. I didn't want to do anything. And the promise of the podcast that was kind of magical was, hey, show up for an hour and talk. I like talking, and I can show up for an hour. So that totally worked. And it was really about, at the time, Johnny and I weren't writing together yet. It was almost like Johnny kind of interviewing what Dave and I were trying to hack at any given time, because we were publishing every single week back then. So that sense of this is what we figured out this week and let's share it was like, that's my favorite thing. Like, I love to talk about what's working, what mistakes we're making, how we're going to like hack this or iterate on that. I like business. I love creative business. I love story business. So back then that was story business, but our business was like 100% indie publishing at the time. Now it's maybe 15% indie publishing, but it's 100% story. So this allows us to kind of reboot and get excited because we're going to be able to talk about the things that are happening that we can really offer to our audience. I felt two things. I felt like we were starving our audience of the best that we could give them because it wasn't necessarily applicable to self-publishing. And at the same time, we were starving ourselves. Like, we were just showing up to do a job. And I think all three of us try very hard not to have a job.
There's various people that I follow their work, like artists and designers, photographers and stuff, and even musicians. And a lot of times, like I especially like when they talk about or they blog about, how their mind works. And there were times I wanted to get them on self-publishing podcast. And every time I tried to think of some excuse to get them on where it would fit, it just didn't. So, and it was always like, we always put the show above like our personal intellectual curiosities, I think. But I think this show allows us to speak to people we wouldn't have spoken to on the other show. And that alone to me is worth blowing up the other show and starting over.
Yeah, totally. There's been so many times when I've come back from an event and thought, oh man, there's just so many like great people that I would love to have a conversation with that I think would provide so much value to our listeners. But our listeners have to know what to do with that. I've used this example a few times, but when Johnny and I went to the Austin Film Festival last year, there were so many guests that would have been really, really great guests, and they would have been guests even on the self-publishing podcast if we had relationships with them and could talk them into it. But we don't have relationships with them, and that's kind of cold. Hey, do you want to come on the self-publishing podcast? Well, why do I want to go on that? It's called the self-publishing podcast.
I don't self-publish though.
I had somebody turn me down because they said, well, my book wasn't self-published. And I was like, well, it doesn't matter. We want to know what you know. But it turned people off,
But we know great storytellers, and storytellers by nature are wonderful teachers. And by surrounding ourselves with quality teachers, we have a lot to share, and we just don't want to starve it of oxygen anymore.
Well, let's talk about what this show will be then. Like, why the Story Studio? What is sort of the underlying thesis here? I'll answer that last question, and it's basically that Story does two major things, and I'm speaking kind of out of my by the seat of my pants right now. There's probably like 5 things, but number one is it's a differentiation point. So there's a lot of noise out in the world right now. I think I put this in the intro. I don't remember when I was writing the intro, but there's a lot of noise, and it's hard to stand out. It's hard to stand out if you're a brand, if you're in any line of business, if you're just trying to get attention, or if you're an author or a creator. And having story pulls people in. It gives them a reason to care, and make you not just a commodity. And
it also connects us. So when I hear a story and Dave hears a story and Johnny hears a story, like we're all together in that, and we can have the same conversation with the same vocabulary, and it gives us a shared experience.
Right. It's the number of times I was going to use connection. The number of times, because this is another thing you might not know if you're new to us, is that we write collaboratively. So we write our own books, and we also show run with other writers. We have a little mini writers room for each of 3 imprints right now.
Television.
Like television. One is sort of a horror, dark fantasy imprint, Collective Inkwell. That's Sean and Dave. One is inquisitive fiction. It's kind of Michael Crichton meets Christopher Nolan. That's Realm and Sands, and that's me and Sean writing together. And then Eros, which is romance, which is collaboratively, like Sean and I have a pen name in there, but there's other writers as well. So we work with other writers. We write our own books. And the number of times that we've been working together, either on a story or just in conversation, like there's things we've been working at, because we've been building a business. Like this is our own story. The story of the Story Studio is its own story. And we'll say something like, well, we're having trouble articulating a point. And we go, it's like when, and then we tell a story from a movie or something. A disproportionate amount of them, for some reason, are from the TV show Friends. It's like when
we actually
wanted to buy that lamp from Pottery Barn, and she said, "Are you saying you'll move out if I don't buy that lamp?" You know, that's how you instantly relate on these things.
Johnny and I actually wrote a book called The One with All the Writing Advice that is just examples from Friends, because we were using it in shorthand so much. Story is shorthand, and it's shorthand for business. It's shorthand for better communication. Good stories are made up with excellent metaphors. And the more you understand more metaphor, the more you can get kind of a main line to people's heart and thought and mind space. And so that's all really exciting. And I think kind of what story is and where it's going is a whole show. We should do that soon.
Maybe next.
Yeah, I mean, really, like it's at the top. I think part of this right now is figuring out what this show is going to be. And because I think we were also energized in the early days by not knowing where we were going show to show, and that's what energized our community too. I think we should do some of that. And I know we met a couple of weeks ago and kind of had like a 12 episode arc for what it should be. I think we should just throw that in the trash and kind of like figure this out episode to episode, and kind of, because isn't that the way we're going to get bored? If we know what episode is coming 12 episodes from now, then it doesn't allow room. Like, Johnny, we're going to Boulder in 2 weeks. I guarantee you we're going to come back with some story that we want to tell, or something that we're going to want to do as a result of that time. Right.
And there's going to be one that's a live show that we totally forgot about. We're recording from the Smarter Artist Summit, which is
I think we need to be pliable here. So let's take this time to, again, start with Dave. Dave, what do you want to see in the new show?
I want to see more conversations. I think we learn from people that aren't necessarily in our space.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the 3 of us each have different interests. And I think all of that fuels us all to be the smarter artists we can be, to use the smarter artist thing. But I believe that. I think that conversation just wakes up parts of you that you might have been sleeping on. So you never know.
I want to reel off a few of the possible topic ideas just to get people's brains percolating. But in the meantime, some people do watch us live. So if you're interested in that, by the way, the link is sterlingandstone.net/SPP live, because it used to be the self-publishing podcast feed and we just didn't change it. So sterlingandstone.net/SPP live. We are going to be 2:15 Central Time most Fridays. Every once in a while, something will be weird, but that's about when it is. So anyway, some of you are here live right now, and I'm curious to see what you guys say you would like to see in the Story Studio podcast. But let me reel off just a few in random order sorts of things that we thought we might talk about. What we learned publishing more than 100 books in terms of craft, business, productivity, collaboration, using story to build a tribe, using story to establish a brand or promote a brand. A lot of people who aren't even they don't consider themselves storytellers. Well, you should be, even if you sell toilet paper. Like if you want to be successful, you can tell a story for your brand.
Yeah, storytellers will always, in the early days of SPP, we made the argument that a really good marketer who is an okay writer is going to outsell a great writer who doesn't know anything about marketing almost always. And I think over the last 5/6 years, that has borne out more times than we can count. Like that is true. And I think we can make the same argument now. If you have two businesses and one is better at telling a story, that business is going to do better.
So Dave usually monitors our chat. Let me know if you see any in there that people are saying that they want to see from the Story Studio.
Well, I want to see. I want to see. Sorry, Dave. Go ahead, Dave.
Why do we push it back 15 minutes? To give us a bit more time to talk before the show and everybody get on the same page and a little bit less throat clearing.
Okay, that's actually something
for you.
Yeah, that's actually something that I want to see in the new show, in the new version, is not hard, fast times. I think before, in the first version of SPP, we just talked, and sometimes those shows ran for like 90 minutes, like ridiculous. And then we came back and we rebooted it and we said, we're always going to stay under an hour. But then we sprawled sometimes and it wasn't necessary.
Well, and we said we want to stay under an hour. And so it became a window of between 55 minutes and 59 minutes. None of them were short.
And what I think is best is, last night I watched Black Mirror, which is, God, it's just so good. And I think I saw maybe my new favorite episode last night. And only reason I picked that episode is because I was really tired and I knew I was probably going to fall asleep. And so it needed to be a little shorter. And I scrolled through and the one I chose was 41 minutes. Some of them are an hour and 20 minutes, right? So there's that's half the length, and that's okay. Like they took exactly the amount of time they needed to tell me the story they wanted to tell. That's what we needed to do. If a show is 33 minutes, that's okay. If it's 58 minutes, that's okay. If we're gelling with somebody and we're in the middle of amazeballs and it goes to an hour and 4 minutes, whatever, that's what it is. And we need to tell the stories and not worry about the time clock so much.
But we're not going to bloat them. So I would imagine a good number of these will be like a half an hour. We want to be concise. Sean, I won't go down a whole rabbit hole here, but Sean and I have a separate podcast where we talk about business, and it's this nice, really value-packed half an hour, and it started to feel good. So anything that, what's the chat saying, Dave?
Mel says, tell us about your other adventures still left hanging about Stone Table, Austin Film Festival, growth of the team, so many open loops in the SPP. Melissa says, definitely more interviews with people that you're collaborating with or people that are doing things that you guys are interested in or fascinated by. Lori Wosel says, encouragement in keeping to getting your writing written before you start marketing, etc. Getting 3 books finished, ready for publishing is not as fun as doing all the other stuff. That's what we have so far.
Yeah. There's a couple things that I really want to see here too. I want to see more involvement from the entire Sterling and Stone team. So really, this has been the Johnny, Sean, and Dave show for several years now. But Sterling and Stone has grown up a lot in the last year, and we're well into double digits of people. We had a company meeting yesterday with 3,000 people. How many people were on that, Johnny? Seriously,
I think 24 or 25, depending on the time. Yeah, depending on how you count, like literal employees versus people that might as well be employees because we work with them so often. It's 25 to 30 people that we're working with now.
Yeah. So that there's a wealth of knowledge there. We have wonderful, articulate storytellers who, with a lot of different world perspectives, and pulling them in to be part of the conversation is important. People, we know extraordinary people. Like we have a really cool network of vibrant thinkers, and bringing them in, when appropriate, absolutely makes sense. I want to see, right now we have Leanne, who is one of the amazing people on our team. She's our content manager for the Sterling and Stone website. And I know we've been promising, if you're an SPP listener, you've heard this over and over, we've been promising great content there. Well, now we actually have a content manager and a plan. So that's going to happen. So part of a better show means better show notes, bullet points, takeaways, things like that. So we'll have our show, but there will be easily consumable way for you to kind of digest it too.
We have a few more here. Love episodes when you learn from mistakes. Ash says,
there'll be plenty of those.
We always make mistakes. Don't worry.
Yeah, we're not running out of those.
Marie says, always loved seeing live brainstorming. More of that would be awesome.
Yes, but now we could do live business brainstorming too, which is different. Like live brainstorming for stories is really fascinating, but kind of like a hot seat environment where, we're trying to solve a business problem live. And I could see doing that with some of our guests. I think that's really, truly magical. If you've seen that live in a room done, it is magical.
Yeah, this isn't a shift of focus. It's a pulling out. If this were a Venn diagram, then what SPP covered was a circle, and this is a larger circle. The audience that we're serving includes the SPP audience, most of them, and a lot more.
Yeah.
And the topics that we'll cover, we can still hit all the things that we used to do about writing and genre and motivation and story structure and that sort of thing, but also a lot more.
Here's one I hope we have, which I like on some of the podcasts I listen to. Rhonda says, have you thought about, take as long as it takes for the podcast, but also offering sort of a bullet list of takeaways? Thanks.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about with better show notes. Like that is absolutely part of it. Leanne's on that. We will have better show notes.
Especially if you can have like clickable times. That would be awesome.
Yeah, we're really up in the game because it's time. Like we spent a long time building for this year, and it was really energizing at the end of last year to kind of wipe it away and say, all right, we're starting the new year with the new podcast and the new ideas, and it's just a really nice convergence point for us. You guys want to hear, like I think there's 4 points of criteria for guests. So I think Dave, I think you'll like these. For those of you who don't know, Dave has a journalism background. And
do you think it's a soft journalism background where he did like human interest pieces on puppies and stuff, or do you think it's like in hardcore investigative journalism going to put?
I did both, to be fair.
Well, I will say that Dave lives in Redacted with Redacted. So what does that tell you?
I prefer actually doing human interest stories, but I was more talented at digging deep.
Yes, but your human interests involve things in basements. Am I right?
Right. Like, did you do the story on the charming old lady who hosted all the bake sales and then died while she was hosting one? Like, is that sort of
that's Dave.
Yeah.
All I have to say, humans are interested in what the corrupt politicians are doing.
Okay, just so you guys who don't know Dave get to know him a little better this episode. The book that he just finished.
Oh no.
He added, like, this wasn't in the outline, but because it came from Dave, he added a dead baby on Christmas morning. That's when it happened, because the dead baby wasn't enough. It had to happen on Christmas morning. That's Dave, ladies and gentlemen.
If your soul doesn't die, he's not happy. He's not happy anyway, but
at least I didn't put it in the stocking.
That's true. Wow. Where does that even come from?
You want people to know me.
And so fast.
You're the one that went dark. All right.
Remember that Mitch Hedberg joke? A severed foot is the ultimate stocking stuffer.
Go ahead, Sean.
Okay.
You're really derailing.
Yeah, here's the 4 criteria. I think, first of all, it has to benefit our listeners, because that's the context that we're putting it in front of, right? We're not
within the narrow confines that used to be on self-publishing.
Right.
You guys go back and listen to the self-publishing podcast. You'll hear me trying to steer an interesting conversation a lot of the times back onto, quote, the rails, which meant, what does your average self-publishing author, what can they get from this? And that's no longer the criteria. Now it's, does it benefit them in terms of story, that sort of thing.
Right, exactly. And I think that that's going to be much easier target to hit. Next, does it benefit our guest, right? I mean, occasionally I'm sure someone could come on as a favor if it really seems beneficial to our audience in some way. But I think a lot of ways it can benefit our guests, and it's up to us to kind of figure out a way to make this win-win for everybody. Next, it should benefit us. I think that's an easy target to hit, because I think every time we have a good conversation, like Dave was saying earlier, it opens up doors, it opens up channels, it opens up windows in our mind space, and we become better thinkers. And lastly, it just has to be story first. Like, what is this? And like we're saying, that's an easier target. When it had to be self-publishing first, that was really limiting. But story first, we can frame our guests and our conversations in a way that puts story first, and therefore puts our audience first.
All right. Well, I think in true tidy fashion, unless you guys have anything that you want to say to set the ground for the Story Studio podcast. Anything?
I'll say something. Just thank you for being here. If you carried over from the self-publishing podcast, you kind of know what you're in for. And I love you dearly. The last 5-6 years was really, really special. And thank you so much for being such a deeply significant part of that. And if you're brand new here, buckle up. Like we're a good time. We're kind of annoying sometimes, sure. But there will be some great takeaways, and you will have a better story. You'll have a better life, a better business if you apply what you hear, because story is the engine that fuels not just our present and our past, but so much of our future. It's where technology is going. It's where business is going. It is the connector. It is the bonder, and you can be better. So we're proud to be a part of that change.
And from the beginning of the self-publishing podcast until now, we have built a significant team, a significant, amazing audience and community, and a business and brand equity using story. Not just literally in that we're writing books, but constantly telling the story of what it is that we're doing. So I like to feel that this is something that we have a little bit of knowledge about. And I think we have some stuff to share given what's happened over the past handful of years. So anyway, then I guess we'll draw to a close this inaugural episode of the Story Studio.
Well, wait. Let's decide what next episode is.
Well, I was just going to do that, but thank you for cutting me off at the balls. So it's good. Right. I'm just going to say that. Do that too, folks.
Please go.
Yeah. So I was going to say we'll draw to a close this episode, but on the next show we're going to talk about why story matters and where story is going. We talked a little bit about.
Oh, that's a really good idea.
Now, but yes, where it's going and just really delving in as to why you actually care. If you're not, you care if you're a writer for obvious reasons, but if you're not, why it matters. So with that, thank you again very much. Thanks to Dave for waking up. I'm telling you, man, he
did wake up about
Whew.
Well, I'd say 20 minutes before the show because he had to reboot his computer.
And when we started talking about dead babies, he just lit right up. He was like, boom.
It's like plugging him into the wall.
Again.
Yeah.
It really is. Wow. I like how layered that joke was. See, that's storytelling, folks.
Well, thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Story Studio podcast. Are you wondering what the ever-growing demand for superb storytelling skills means for your future? Check out our latest interview as Johnny and Sean dive deep into that question in Storytelling is the Future, How to Build on Your Self-Publishing Success. Download the interview from the info box or show notes in YouTube, or head over to sterlingandstone.net/future.